When I was a kid, my favorite Disney movie was Peter Pan, and since then I have watched every single movie that you could possibly watch about Peter Pan, from Robin Williams' Hook to the version Pan that just came out. And I loved Peter Pan so much because of Neverland. It was this place where you could stay young forever and just have these awesome adventures. And that's why I responded so well to the quote from Jonathan Gottschalk this week from the reading, who said, "We are attracted to Neverland because it's good for us." He explains in The Storytelling Animal that storytelling nourishes our imaginations, it reinforces moral behavior, and it gives us safe worlds to practice inside. So, really, what Jonathan Gottschalk is talking about is that story is the glue of human social life. It defines groups and it holds us together as human beings. So, why does storytelling matter in terms of speeches? Well, human beings live in a storm of stories. We live in stories all day long. Our friends tell us stories, our coworkers tell us stories, and when we go to bed at night, we also dream in stories. We communicate through stories to tell people about our day and how we feel about certain things, and we learn from them as well. And when we get home from a long day work, we collapse into stories from TVs and movies and even music. Without personal life stories to organize our experience, our own lives lack meaning. So, we want to figure out how we can use the power of storytelling to communicate a message in our upcoming speeches. So, to do that, we want to talk about two things: the science of storytelling and the technique of storytelling. First, let's start out with the science of storytelling. Let's figure out exactly why this is an effective way of communicating a message to people. Ethos 3 is a company that designs visual presentations for speakers, and they have this great blog that analyzes communication and how it works. And they have this article about your brain on data. And they explain that whenever we receive basic information, like a lecture or a grocery list, we activate two areas of the brain, Broca's area and Warnick's area. These areas of the brain are just named after the two neuroscientists that discovered them. Now, what happens is cognitive load theory is at work here. It explains that our minds can easily become overloaded if we're required to process too much complex information. So, when our brains reach capacity, information passes through our minds like facts and figures, but it doesn't stick. So, whenever an audience is arriving to your presentation, their minds are probably already at capacity. So, even if they've had a break of sorts, they're thinking about all of their other classes or what they have to do with at work or things that are going on in their personal lives. They may even still be reading emails or text messages on their phone right before your presentation. So, it's safe to assume that the audience's brains are already at capacity before they even sit down to listen to you. So, how can we combat that? Well, Ethos 3 goes on to explain how our brain works on stories. And our minds prefer stories to facts because stories are easy to remember. It's easier to recall these descriptive tales because they activate up to 7 areas of the human brain. So, more of your brain is working, which is why stories are easier to remember. Remember when we talked earlier this week about vivid imagery? Well, all of that vivid imagery is highlighting a different part of the brain. For example, the sensory cortex and cerebellum light up whenever we talk about anything related to touch, or the motor cortex lights up whenever we talk about movement. So, these areas of the brain combine with the language processing and language comprehension parts of the brain to create a very vivid experience. With so many areas of the mind engaged, listeners are experiencing the story instead of just processing it. So basically, when you add storytelling to your mix of content, your brain just starts working differently. Now, like we talked about last week, the brain doesn't know the difference between reading or hearing about an experience and actually encountering it in real life. For example, neuroscientists at Emory University used an MRI to scan the brain's response and discovered that when their subjects read a descriptive metaphor out loud rather than just plain text, the sensory receptors in the cortex lit up. That's because the sensory cortex is responsible for remembering things that have happened to us, like the smell of hot chocolate or the way soft cotton sheets feel. So, according to the study, metaphors like the singer had a velvet voice and he had leathery hands highlighted that sensory cortex, while phrases like the singer had a pleasing voice or he had strong hands did not. Now, we know that stories work because people are using stories all the time, from musicians to social media to advertising to computer programming and gaming to TV and radio and movies. That's because stories work, and people know that this is an effective way to reach audiences and have them buy our products and services and art. So now that we understand why stories work, now we need to figure out how to use them to our advantage. And that brings us to the technique of storytelling. And I've picked three people who use storytelling within their own industry to create meaning for people. The first person I want to talk about is Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais is a comedian and a writer and a TV producer. And he has this great quote that says, "Being honest is what counts. Trying to make the ordinary extraordinary is so much better than starting with the extraordinary." So we have to figure out just the everyday thing and figure out how to make it extraordinary. What's the story behind your business, your passion, your career, your experience that brought you to this point in time today? Who or what inspires you? What is a mantra you repeat to yourself? A story is something that must be real, and it must be something that we can connect to and relate to because you're a real person and we're a real person as well. Emma Coates is a former Pixar artist, and she has this great quote about putting things on paper. She says, "Putting it on paper lets you start fixing it. If it stays in your head, this perfect idea, you'll never share it with anyone." That kind of goes back to that quote we started out with in the beginning of the semester with Lee Iacocca. And remember, last week we talked about how organization allows you to figure out the best way to tell the story. The important thing is to understand that you aren't stuck when it comes to creating a story. It's totally acceptable to follow a structure. And Jonathan Gottschall, the American literary scholar who's quoted in our reading this week, also talks about how big brands like Coca-Cola use stories to market their products. They say that Coca-Cola knows that deep down they are much more a story factory than a beverage factory. No matter what they'd like us to believe, Coke's success isn't due to some magic in their fizzy syrup water. Think of all the Coca-Cola ads that you've seen. You don't ever see them talking about the ingredients in their product. In fact, they kind of don't want you to know about the ingredients in their product because it's not so great for you. But in all of their advertising, you see all these people and families having these amazing experiences, and you want to be a part of that. So now we know about the science of storytelling, and we understand that when we tell stories, more parts of the brain light up, which allow the audience to remember the information and avoid cognitive overload theory. And also, we know the technique of stories by focusing on real things, ordinary things that happen to us, as well as how to create a structure and get to know the audience to connect these stories to them. So, like Jonathan Gottschall said, we are attracted to Neverland because it is good for us. It allows us to interact with people and it allows us to remember information much more effectively. So, now you want to go and figure out how you can tell your own Neverland in your next speech.